Testing, 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 testing.
Can you all hear me?
Can you hear me?
Keep talking for a minute. Let's see if
All
we
right.
get it.
Let's see if we can get this a little bit louder. I see Claude Moulton in the back. Tim, a lot of familiar faces.
Okay. Well, they will continue to adjust the sound if that's not quite loud enough as we go along. But I want to start by thanking you all for being here, and most especially Ted. I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I know Ted, so you all know, is an architect, and he has done a great deal of work with us here at the Cathedral. And that's actually where I'd like to start this conversation. I'd like to start by hearing about how you became interested in architecture, how you became an architect, and what led you to where you are.
Well, when I was, according to my siblings, older siblings, they said when I was a child, I sort of could not sit still. And especially when in church, my mother figured out a way to keep me quiet. So she'd bring a pad of paper and a pencil and give it to me, and that seemed to work. So that led to many other things. As you're doodling or drawing, you start seeing patterns and geometries, and I'm sure that a lot of people came into architecture that way in Europe and in the United States. So I think it's a love that you develop. When I was growing up in Jacksonville, the Naval Air Station, it was the Second World War, and it was a training center. And there were a lot of airplanes all over the place, always. So I started drawing airplanes, and then as I got older, I started designing cars, and then that led to going up to Clemson, and the dean of the school at that time of engineering told me, well, maybe you need to go to the third floor. I went up there and saw all these beautiful drawings by students, and I decided I wanted to do that.
So it sounds like it was in the church that you found your calling.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Maybe distracting you from church, but one or the other. God is at work always. So after you graduated, how did you get your start working as an architect in Jacksonville?
Well, I grew up here, and after I went in the service 2 years, I came back, and then I started working. My first employer was Robert Broward, who was an architect that had worked for Frank Lloyd Wright, and I had been studying him very much. So that clicked well. And then after that, I worked with Taylor Hart, this is on May Street over there where Riverside Presbyterian is now, but at one time May Street had a number of old homes that were filled by architects and structural engineers. So I started working there, and then I worked at one time with Reynolds Smith and Hills to get experience with a big firm. But then I went out on my own in 1968.
And you've had a relationship with the Cathedral for a handful of years now. How did that begin?
I'm not quite sure.
What was your first project with the Cathedral?
Well, I've been working with the music suite upstairs. We did the nursery on the first floor. We did a lot of interior modifications, but I had always been impressed with this structure, and I think it's a great symbol for Jacksonville. I think it's a great symbol for our city, and that would.
Well, that leads me exactly to where I wanted to go. I want to, as we think about this cathedral and its architecture a little bit, I want to put it in context. I'd like to, first of all, think about its context in the city of Jacksonville, and second of all, its context in the history of church architecture. So can you start by talking a little bit about architecture in the city of Jacksonville and how the cathedral fits into that?
Okay. Well, architecture in Jacksonville, especially before the 1950s, it seemed at that point in time everything was beginning to go modern, and a lot of structures came down. A lot of downtown really had some historic structures, and at that time the new phase, the new modern architecture was to not respect the old proportions. I think the Cathedral District is a very important district. There is no neighborhood in Jacksonville at all that has a cluster of 5 historic, wonderful, great buildings. There's the Cathedral, there's the Immaculate Conception, First Presbyterian, Mount Zion, AME Church. It's a real cluster, and I can imagine what this neighborhood was like when all the homes were still here that were taken down. So I think the Cathedral District is a model for all of Jacksonville. Jacksonville has grown rapidly with limited access highways. So we're a city of highways, and as a result of that, we've been spread out. What I like about the Cathedral District is a cluster of wonderful spaces and wonderful buildings.
You mentioned that in this city, we don't seem to have had the architectural respect for what came before, especially maybe in the 1950s and thereafter.
Right after the 1950s, the modernist movement sort of did away with the traditional.
Was that more pronounced in Jacksonville than other cities, or was it a national trend?
No, I think it is a national thing, but it was pronounced. If you compare us, let's say, to Savannah and Charleston, even St. Augustine, I mean, the appreciation of the art of the past is really there. But it is a national thing, and architects being the way they are, they would like to create their own ideas. So I think that's part of the problem. It's the continuous creating of spaces and all.
So part of the time period you're talking about is obviously in the wake of World War II. How did World War II impact the history of Jacksonville and architecture here?
Right. Well, World War II, there was a great deal of influx of people, especially Navy soldiers and officers. It started, I guess, right in 1940, 42, and it was a major training base, and it brought about a lot of people that came in here, and a lot of people that stayed after the war. But that was mainly it. It was just a very active place, and of course it became big. You needed to have large stores to be able to feed all the sailors, and Winn-Dixie came and other stores came like that. But it had a lot to do with the thrust of so much new energy in highways and roads and rooftops.
Highways, what's the phrase that you've used about retail and rooftops?
Oh, I said it starts with rooftops, then it's retail, and then there was one more, I forget now, but yeah, it starts with roads. The roads extend out all the way from Ponte Vedra to Orange Park and beyond. When you have the roads, then the rooftops, the houses come, and then retail comes, and everything else comes. That's the way it goes.
So the city's architecture was shaped a great deal in the 50s and thereafter. If we go back 50 years prior, we had the Great Fire of 1901. How did that impact the architectural context of our city?
Well, with the fire, it destroyed almost all of downtown, very similar to the fire in Chicago and I think out in San Francisco. Once all those and there were homes and buildings were destroyed, it sort of, in a sense, it was a blessing in disguise because now you had a blank piece of paper and the city started growing. I think this church was built in 1905. And most of the things happened like that. And there was this energy that it came about by there was so much to do, and that made it happen.
So this church is interesting because we've had a church here, obviously not this structure,
right.
Kind of back to the 1800s, and then it's kind of evolved kind of during these evolutions of architectural history in Jacksonville. Looking at the other big contextual question, can you speak a little bit to the history of church architecture in general? Maybe starting as far back as kind of Greek temples and Byzantine and Romanesque and Gothic. How does it all fit together?
Well, I think they would quote a famous Roman architect by the name of Vitruvius. He said every building had firmness, commodity, and delight, except he said it in Latin. I can't remember the Latin. Firmness was structural soundness. Obviously, you don't want to be in something that isn't structurally sound. Commodity was function. And delight was a spiritual aspect that gave joy to being inside. And I think this facility, this is just tremendous in itself, that it has the structural form that is very has the strength expressed. The commodity is a beautiful space here for worship, and the light is done by all the poetry that you find in the windows and the roof, the trusses, and the altar area, the transepts. All those things come together. They're almost like it's a community in itself. It's a little bit like Christianity. It all comes together as one unified whole.
So what would you say are some of the most significant architectural types in churches?
Well, the architectural types, it starts off, the early period of Gothic was pointed arches, vaults, it had flying buttresses. So if you look at the ratio of this church, the width of the floor plan to the height is almost 1-to-1. The width is almost as tall as the height. And then you got into early Gothic, and the ratio was maybe 1-to-10. They wanted, in those periods of time, they wanted to really express the heavenly aspects of the interior of the church and all. So they got really tall. And as they got tall, they needed scaffolding, and that's when they brought about the flying buttresses. As you went into history, so we're talking about from 1300 to, let's say, around the Gothic revival, which happened in the 1900s. There's been a change in the way the Gothic architecture has come about. American Gothic architecture. I gave also a lecture at St. Mark's. I saw a couple of faces here. In St. Mark's, they asked me to define what kind of Gothic architecture St. Mark's Episcopal Church was. And of course, it's made out of brick, whereas Gothic is mostly stone. But I kept trying to find it in all the sources I could, resources, and finally some person that was familiar with the church was up in North Carolina, and he told me, well, it's called Modified American Scholastic Gothic. That's the title of the Gothic. So
awfully specific.
Yeah, very specific. This Gothic style, I think, is clearly American. It's more practical, and it's very functional. Now, you'll see that there are pointed elements in this thing, but if you look at the pointed windows, unlike the early Gothic, they were very pointed, like what you can see behind me. The shape of the pointed windows in the back is much more vertical, and I think that it became a very a common thing to bring things down. I think Charleston has a lot of churches like this also. But the aspects, the gargoyles, you have gargoyles here, and a lot of churches don't have gargoyles. And they start out being for drainage, roof drainage and all, but also it's supposed to scare away the spirits, the bad spirits. But I just think that this space has, and I understand that the windows there on that side are Tiffany windows. Is that correct?
That's a Tiffany window back. That's the one Tiffany window in the sanctuary is right back there.
Right.
Jesus is the shepherd.
Right, right. So it has all the wonderful things, and I think the thing that impresses me the most is that Gothic architecture, more than any other kind of architecture, symbolizes Christianity and the unity of the parts. Everything works together. They say if you take one element out, it all comes down. So I think that is an important aspect of the church, Gothic churches, Christian churches. I did start earlier when we were rehearsing this, was to say that if you look at the styles, it's been the roof that created the problems. At the early Greek church, I should say the Greek temple, they had marble was their material, and they did not have wide spacing. They had to have columns, quite a few columns, to support the marble roof above. Over time, that evolved over to the Romanesque architecture, which had rounded arches, but it still had trusses like this. And then you get into the Gothic architecture, you started getting into the pointed arches and all that came with that.
So some of the major hints that you're in a Gothic church as opposed to a Romanesque are Gothic are more likely to have pointed, vaulted windows and ceilings. They're taller, they're more vertically pronounced. I think they generally have more light, they have more windows.
Absolutely, much more light. And if you look at the statues, they were very vertical, like you. All the people, the holy people were there were very tall. If you look in the windows there, you can see they're tall. And if you get at ancient Greece, they weren't quite as tall.
And then flying buttresses are another big clue of Gothic architecture, right? But those end up supporting the churches from the outside.
Right. When you get that tall, it gets very unstable. And so what you get is really it's a form of scaffolding, but it's beautiful scaffolding. They used it with a lot of ornateness and all.
So one of the things that's interesting about the cathedral here is we're not just one building, and we weren't kind of just built at one time. We have different structures around campus that were built at very different times.
Right.
Cummings may be the most pronounced different example, our chapel. Can you speak a little bit to the architecture of Cummings Chapel? Raise your hand if you've been to Cummings Chapel. Hopefully most of us.
Well, it was done by Kemp Bunch and Jackson, a very famous, or I should say recognized architectural firm. As a matter of fact, I was part of that firm at one time. It became more of a modern expression of poetry. It's a complete circle, and then all the beautiful radiating aspects of it makes it a very modern space. It's quite different from the vertical space. It's more a ceiling that's not as vertical.
And how has the cathedral evolved over the course of its history? It's been burned down multiple times. It's had different iterations. How's that impacted it architecturally?
Well, I think it became larger each time. After the first one burned down, it became larger. They used more material that was more permanent material. The fire taught them a lesson, and the walls are stone, and the trusses here are very powerful, very strong. I'm not sure if the wood is cypress or whether it's some form of heart pine, but I think that it's been said it's cypress. I haven't checked that out. But the congregation, I would think, also grew over the period of time, and it has become the famous structure in downtown. We do have the Immaculate Conception, which also has a very beautiful vertical characteristic. It's very delicate. Also, the First Presbyterian Church is a beautiful church. It at one time was a circular church, and the congregation grew so much that they took out the south end and expanded out in that direction. But if you go in that church and you look up, you'll find a lot of beauty similar to this if you're looking north. But then it becomes an expanded assembly space, and it doesn't have the charm that it did initially.
One of the things that I notice when I walk into especially Gothic churches is the verticality we've talked about. And in a very real way, at least I find when I walk in, it does draw my eye up. I mean, you have such a vertical space, and certainly in here also, it's just, there's no other space I can think of in Jacksonville that I go into that is this vertical. And that really does impact me as I draw my eye up. I mean, I look heavenward. I mean, I think what the space is meant to do. It's meant to help us think about things that are bigger than whatever stuff we're dealing with in the moment. Right. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it gives you the heavenly realm that you're in. I think that's important. It gives you a desire to pray, yes.
That's exactly right. Can you speak to any of the architectural elements of this church that help shape your spirituality, or that help you think about things differently when you walk into them?
Well, I like the unity of the complex. I like the unity within here with the windows, the roof, but I like the unity of the other buildings next door, the Cathedral House and all that. I like the fact that it's been designed in a way that it makes a presence in downtown, and it's something that everyone aspires to come into. And I'm sure you get a lot of visitors from outside of Jacksonville.
We certainly do, and that is a beautiful image. That unity. It's us coming together, and it's what we do every week. People from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds come together because we're bound together by something that's so much bigger than ourselves individually.
Right, absolutely, that's true.
In a few minutes, we're going to open up for conversation for everyone. But are there any final thoughts you want to add before we take questions from those gathered?
Well, the only thing I can say that I think any person that comes in here for the first time she's overwhelmed by the beauty, number one, and by the balance and by the unity. It all comes together, and I just think it's something that you feel good being in the space. You feel good to be here to pray.
Well, I certainly know I feel good when I'm here to pray. At this point, we're going to have a microphone. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand, and the microphone will be brought to you. Don't try to just shout without the microphone, because many people watching are watching online, and they won't hear you no matter how loud you shout, unless you have the microphone. So Nancy will bring that to you. Does anyone have any questions? And hold the microphone closer to your mouth than you think.
Okay. Hey there, Ted. So I wanted to ask about the placement of the altar in relation to these various types of
Did you hear that?
Yes, she wants to know about the placement of the altar.
altar.
Well, in Christian churches, I know in Eastern Christian churches, all the altars face east. This altar also faces east. Mm-hmm. And that's an important part because the sun rises at that side, and that sort of creates the symbolic meaning of a church, that the light comes in, it's coming in from the east. This is also common, I think, with other groups of people, Muslims and all like that. Facing east is an important thing. As a matter of fact, they say that in Eastern Orthodox churches, if you ever get lost in Europe, all you have to do is find a church, and you know that if you go at the front end of it, that's facing east. And I'm sure this is true of a lot of churches.
For many churches, you have the altar up against the wall, and the priest
Yes.
historically would celebrate the Eucharist with, I would say his or her, but it really was his back to the congregation.
Right.
So it's a more recent architectural development to have an altar out in the middle of the room like
Right,
this.
right. As a matter of fact, in the Orthodox Church, the priest still faces east with his back to the congregation, which I don't like.
Very good question. Thank you, Denise.
Sir, would you have a list of what you think are the three most significant
Can you help
architectural
me with
pieces
that
in
mic here?
Jacksonville?
Yes, I think you asked what are the three most architecturally significant spaces in Jacksonville?
Well,
You better name the cathedral.
absolutely, the cathedral. I was trying to think beyond that. I think the cluster of them, I think if you've been in the Cathedral District, Mount Zion AME Church, which is not far from here, if you've been inside that church, it's very different. It's got a round floor plan. The congregation bends around the altar. The top of the stained glass windows are rounded. As a matter of fact, there's one portrayal of Christ as in being black it's in the west. If you go there and you look at, we're currently helping them restore their church. It has a lot of wonderful things, but instead of having pointed arches, their congregation is sit in the round, so to speak, and it's also the balcony is in the round, and all the windows don't have pointed arches. They have more, it's more Romanesque. And I didn't answer the question fully. There are a lot of wonderful churches in Jacksonville. I personally spent a lot of time with the Riverside Presbyterian. My wife taught there and was there as an administrator for about 35 years, so I got to know Riverside very well. And I know that Reverend Kissling, one of the first ministers there, really put a lot of time in having the stained glass windows storage. It's just very, very elegant with the stained glass. I like, I've worked with Good Shepherd Church. It also has beautiful windows, and it has a very good acoustical space, and it's used a lot for concerts. Anyhow, there are other churches that, I'm sorry, I'm getting such an echo. Bob Brower designed a Unitarian church on Arlington Expressway. That church wants to celebrate nature, and it looks out toward a wonderful green kind of hollowed out area. But there are many churches. There's some modern churches that have been built in down at the beach. Bill Morgan designed a Methodist church that had a curvilinear way to let light in from the side. You didn't see the light coming in, but you saw the light as it touched the wall, the altar wall. But there are a lot of wonderful churches. I like, and I think there's a book coming out very soon on the river churches in North Florida or North and Central Florida. I think Canon Dupree has been involved in that.
And our bookstore is helping to spearhead that project. So there will certainly be more information about that as it comes together.
I like them because they were very small churches, and they had a vertical sense because they weren't that wide, but it was very intimate. Small groups, probably half the size or maybe less than that of this church, but if you just see it that way, I like that. I like the wooden churches. They call them Carpenter's Gothic, and very popular in North Florida. Hey, Tim.
Hey, Ted. Had an architectural/business question for you. It seems you've mentioned many churches that you have worked on in Jacksonville.
Can you help me with that?
Yes, you've worked on many churches in Jacksonville. Tim has an architectural/business question. He probably wants to steal ideas from you.
Was it a conscious decision on your part to, how did you get involved? I mean, because you have this reputation in town of being the expert on church architecture. Is that something you consciously went towards? Did you just find yourself drawn?
I have hearing
towards
aids, so I want to get it.
Yeah, so this is coming from an architect. You are known throughout town as one of the premier architects working with churches and historical church structures. Did you intentionally set out to become known as that, or did you stumble into that? How did it happen?
Well, my first church was St. John's the Divine on Atlantic Boulevard, and I started doing that. The other church that I did was the Resurrection Catholic Church, which was very modern, and I can't describe it, but it looks like a ship, the bow of a ship. But I just got into that. I really started off doing a lot of restoration, upgrading older churches and working on that. I'm working on St. Philip's, which is an Episcopal church on Union Street, as well as AME Church. We're currently talking with a group that's an outgrowth of the Russian Orthodox Church, and anyhow, I'm not sure how that's going to evolve, but I'm looking forward to it. So I think of all the buildings, when you think about it, all the buildings that an architect can deal with, in most cases, the aspect of commodity is important, commodity function. In other words, you really have to, there's just so many different types of buildings that have so many different kind of functions, but they're not anything compared to a large space that is embellished with art. And I think the concept of delight or spiritual experience in a church, you see it all. You see the poetry, you see all the unification, you see a unity. In office buildings, they can be very tall, and they can have a number of different offices. They're big boxes with small boxes in between. Whereas in churches, the box, it's the art of the inn. You see it, it's here, it's all at once. And you don't get that experience unless you might go into a museum. So it's a specialized type of architecture, and I think thank God it's been lasting.
Hi, Ted.
Hello, Claude.
Last week we had Scott Brown talk about the windows, and one of the things that impressed me was the symmetry of things, that these aren't, the windows aren't just placed randomly, and also that the church, obviously, although you don't, when we see the finished product, we sometimes forget that this was put together over a long period of time.
Help me.
Yes. So Claude is saying last week Scott Brown talked about the stained glass windows, and he was impressed. Claude was impressed by how these windows were not just put there willy-nilly. There was an intentionality and some symmetry in where they were placed.
Right, and over a long period of time.
And yeah, it wasn't just kind of they were all done at once. It was over many years.
So I guess more a comment, but also a question is, who does this? You know, having worked with committees a lot, it seemed like that would be not the sort of thing that should be involved in designing a church from scratch, and a little bit of how this process works, especially. I think things are built more quickly now, but you know, a building like this that was put together over years and years and years really astounds me how it can all come together and be as great as it is.
So if you look at our campus, we have buildings that are built 70 years apart from one another, and yet there's this incredible continuity and this unity that you talked about. How does that happen? How do people not have different ideas and sort of say, well, forget the old, let's do something totally different here?
Yeah. Well, I think the mere fact that it takes up a full block, or a half of a block, I should say, but there's a street between the Liberty Street and right behind us here. It was a functional reality. It had to be in order to maintain the unity of the services, the offices, the classrooms, the rooms for the young kids, the nurseries and all like that. Claude and I, fortunately, had worked together on Operation New Hope in a building designed by Clutho, who is Jacksonville's most famous architect. And it does have stained glass windows, but it's not, what am I trying to say, religious. And it was one of the most beautiful buildings in Jacksonville. And we spent a lot of years together in the conference room in that space.
So it seems like part of the answer is people having the humility to realize that they're going to subject their personal architectural ideas to conform to what came before them. Is that right? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think Christianity offered so many different variations coming through the years since the early Gothic, mid-Gothic, late Gothic, Gothic revival. It had so much more opportunity. And one thing I haven't pointed out was, if you look at the windows, if you look at the doors, if you look behind me here, there's something called, in architecture, bilateral symmetry. Bilateral symmetry. That bilateral symmetry, it occurs everywhere, is a unifying element. And the plan has bilateral symmetry. So if you look at something that impresses you, check it out for the bilateral symmetry. The face is bilateral symmetry, and I guess that's where we start liking bilateral symmetry. But I wanted to point out, too, before we finish here, if you could hold that. There's a book by Wayne Wood. I think some of you have this book, but Wayne Wood is one of Jacksonville's historians about architecture. He's not an architect. He used to be an eye doctor, but he's always loved architecture. And he has every important building in Jacksonville, in every community, whether it's the west side, whether it's the beaches, whether it's downtown. If you haven't got this book and you do like architecture, you'll really like this book. It's about $60, but it's well worth it. It's very heavy, too.
I think we have time for one more question. Did we have another question?
Well, first I want to say, Ted, I've lived here 50-something years, and every time something good or exciting or modern was happening in Jacksonville, you were involved in it. So you are our great treasure.
Whenever there's something good or exciting that happens in Jacksonville, you're there. So
She knows that
you're
because
involved
she's
with it.
there. Susan Caven is one of the leaders, and right now she's part of the riverfront in Jacksonville.
Anyway, you mentioned Gothic churches, and we have the San Marco Preservation Hall, which is a lovely Carpenter Gothic church. I think moved about 4 or 5 times. You have old St. Andrews you worked on. And
Oh, yeah.
What is the connection between those different styles?
I didn't get all.
What's the connection between the different styles of churches you've worked on, the Carpenter Gothic, to this American Gothic, and how does it all? St. Andrews.
Well, St. Andrews was is a beautiful church, and it became part of the Historical Society. It became vacated. At one time, this is what's happened to downtown. At one time, that was a community. There were a lot of people living around the church. And it's one of the early churches. We had the opportunity to repair it. When you went inside the church, the trusses were rotten. You could see outside. When it rained, you could come in. So a lot of money was spent to restore it. But it is a early Gothic. It doesn't have, it has pointed arches. It doesn't have buttresses. It doesn't have gargoyles. And it, like this, has a wooden truss roof. Yeah, pretty much like this. Not as elaborate as this, but it does. Yeah. And San Marco has some wonderful churches, too. What did you think?
We need to save that church.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, you helped save that church.
Yes. That was a blessing. I was given that opportunity.
I remember when I was young, growing up in this church, sitting right there where Tim and Gloria are sitting, and there is this visual feast in this space. So we've been ending each of these conversations with prayer. What do we generally do when we pray? We close our eyes and we look down. So I'm gonna invite us to do something different before we close in prayer today. I'm gonna invite you to not close your eyes, not look down, take a minute and look around at this space and keep your eyes open. Find something architectural to look at as we close in prayer, okay? We'll take a few seconds to let our eyes wander. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
God, you bless us with so much visual beauty. You bless us with architects and artists who bring this beauty together and help surround us by it so that we can remember your beauty, remember your creation, and remember the beauty and love that you call each of us to carry forth into the world and in our lives. In your Son's name we pray.
Amen. Thank you very much for
Thank
this
you.
opportunity.